To know means to act. Human knowledge is essentially active. To know is to transform reality in order to understand how a certain state is brought about. Knowing an object does not mean copying it. It means acting upon it. Knowing reality means constructing systems of transformation that correspond more or less adequately to reality. Knowledge is a system of transformations that becomes progressively adequate. In fact, if all knowledge is always in a state of development and consists in proceeding from one state to a more complete and efficient one, evidently it is a question of knowing this development and analyzing it with the greatest possible accuracy. So here are the sorts of questions that Piaget addressed himself to. They're very fundamental questions. Upon what does an individual base his judgments? What are his norms? How is it that these norms are validated? What's the interest of such norms for the philosophy of science in general? And how does the fact that children think differently affect our presumption of fact itself? More problems. How do children conceptualize number and space and time and speed? How do they understand that objects hidden from view are actually still there? How do they understand that entities that can transform from one place to another are the same entities? How do we understand chance or moral concerns, play patterns and dreams, and how is it that we imitate others, and what does it mean that we can? Now, here's a definition of constructivism. This is from Piaget as well. Knowledge does not begin in the I, and it does not begin in the object. It begins in the interactions. There is a reciprocal and simultaneous construction of the subject on the one hand and the object on the other. There is no structure apart from construction, either abstract or genetic. Now, so, let's take some of that apart. The first thing that Piaget is pointing out is that trying to understand what knowledge is by referring to a body of facts seems to be somewhat problematic, because facts shift with time, and people understand facts differently at different stages of development. Even though, hypothetically, we all live in the same world, it turns out that we can get by, in some sense, with structures of knowledge that differ from one another. I think the easiest way to understand that is actually to take something like a pragmatic perspective. And a pragmatist, and I think Piaget is a pragmatist, and pragmatic people basically say that, because they're interested in what constitutes truth, and of course we know that we don't have absolute truth about anything. So the question is, if you don't have absolute truth about anything, how do you know when what you know is enough? And the pragmatic answer to that is, you set your own conditions for truth with each of your actions. And the way you do that is by specifying an outcome. So if you tell a joke and the outcome is that people should laugh, you know, even if 70% of the people laugh, then that's probably good enough. And so you could say that you've done a good enough job of matching your social knowledge to the circumstance to obtain your desired end. And so Piaget's notions of what constitute valid knowledge structures seem to be very, very much pragmatic in origin. And it's also partly because Piaget is a thinker who's deeply considered the fact of human embodiment. And in fact, I think Piaget has done that more than any of the thinkers that we're going to talk about. And so, for Piaget, truth is determined in action. The next proposition is that when you're trying to understand knowledge, you should understand the process by which it's generated rather than the outcome of the knowledge process itself, because the outcomes transform across circumstances, but the nature of the process that you engage in to produce knowledge seems to be constant across situations. So, and what is that process? Well, that's the next part of constructivism. For Piaget, you can think of, for Piaget in some sense, the reality is a field of latent information. And in interacting with that information, you code some of it, both physically and abstractly, and out of that coding, not only do you generate yourself, but you also generate, well, if not the object itself, so to speak, at least your perceptions of the object. So when you're continually engaged from a Piagetian perspective in trying to produce certain transformations in the world, and as you produce them in an embodied sense, because you're acting in the world, you map the transformations that occur onto the transformations of your body, and that mapping constitutes your practical knowledge. So, as I said, for Piaget, the body of knowledge that guides you is always action predicated. Now, I want to provide you with another way of understanding Piaget so that as we go through what he has to say, we can not only understand what he has to say, but we can link it to the other things that we're going to talk about. Now, there's a man named Jerome Bruner who talked about narrative constructivism, and Bruner said, we seem to have no other way of describing lived time save in the form of a narrative. So I'm going to review a little bit for you what might constitute a basic narrative, and then I want to talk to you about the way that narratives transform, because one of the Piagetian propositions is that at a given time in development you might have a way of interacting with the world, say a schema, that is good enough for the aims that you want to pursue at that particular point in time. But there may come a time when there are transformations of one sort or another that could be specific to you or that could actually happen in the world, where if you continue to perceive and act in that manner, you're not going to get what you want. And so, for example, here's an example from a developmental perspective. When you're 8 years old, it's probably okay for your mother to arrange play dates for you, but if that's still happening when you're 15, there's a problem. And so you can see that the manner in which someone interacts with the world, even if it's successful at one point, isn't necessarily successful in the next. And sometimes there are qualitative transformations in the world that mean that the structure that you're looking at the world through has to reconstruct itself to take in more information, and then you have to act out that new body of knowledge. That would be accommodation from a Piagetian point of view. Piaget assumes that there's two things happening when you're interacting with the world. One is that your current body of knowledge is sufficient, and all you have to do is add to it in a rather normative way. And if any of you know anything about Thomas Kuhn, that is roughly equivalent to Thomas Kuhn's theory of normal science. So normal science occurs when the body of theory within a given scientific domain is quite sketched out, and what people are doing is basically mopping up the details. So you might say that right now in personality theory, the psychometric Big Five models are paradigmatic, and what people are doing is not so much arguing about whether or not that structure exists, but are arguing about something smaller, which is what information can you derive from the world if you take as your set of assumptions that those 5 dimensions exist. And you can see that that's a less comprehensive question than do the 5 dimensions themselves exist. So assimilation is when you have a notion of how to act in the world so that things happen the way you want them to, and you can just add more to that. And accommodation occurs when instead the novelty and the transformations that you've encountered are so large that you have to reconstitute the theory itself in order to progress. So for example, in the example I used, where when you're 8 or 9 years old you can have play dates arranged, but you can't when you're 15, the reason for that is that you're undergoing a series of maturational changes. A large number of them are physiological. And so you have to change the assumptions that you use to deal with the world. And so one of the prime assumptions might be when you're a child that it's okay for one of your parents to serve as a mediator of your social interactions, but by the time you've hit puberty, then all of a sudden that becomes inappropriate, and if you continue to use the same schema, then you're stuck at a developmental stage that you shouldn't be stuck at. That'd be roughly equivalent to Freud's idea of fixation. It's a similar idea. So